Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Shoshana Keats Jaskoll. I am in from Israel, though I'm originally from New Jersey. So I am from an organization, I'm a co-founder of Chochmat Nashim. Chochmat Nashim is an organization that is in Israel that basically raises the voices of Jewish women in the larger conversation and fights against extremism that is damaging to our community. I am here tonight to discuss a topic that is, in my opinion, the most damaging issue to Judaism, especially Jewish women, but really the entire Jewish community that we feel very strongly about, and that we in Israel experience slightly differently than you guys experience it in America and in the rest of the diaspora. And I think that we need to learn from one another, best practices, the things that we can, the things that we can change, deal with the things that we maybe can only affect but not change, and the role of the community in making that change is really where Chochmat Nashim comes in.
Perfect. I'm Keshet Starr. We have to use this microphone for the video, so bear with me. I'm the executive director of ORA, the Organization for the Resolution of Agunot, and we deal with the Agunah issue on a case-by-case basis worldwide. We do it in a few different ways. We have an advocacy team that works on about 70 active cases and really works with Agunot to create an individualized strategy and really bring the follow-up and professionalism and strategic thinking that is needed to resolve these really complex cases. We also run a Jewish divorce helpline that fields about 1,000 calls a year from people just trying to figure out where to start with the Jewish divorce process. And we also do quite a bit of educational programming in high schools, colleges, shuls, communities. We speak to attorneys, rabbis, college teachers, just different key players in the Jewish divorce world to make sure that they understand the issue of get refusal and that they have tools to address it effectively and to prevent get refusal cases from happening before they start, which is really a key goal for us. And the final thing I'll add is that we also do a lot of work around the halachic prenup, which is a prevention tool to stop get refusal before it happens. And we work to standardize that tool in the Orthodox community and to really use that to make a broader generational change on this issue.
Hi, my name is Daphne Lazar-Price, and first of all, I just want to say how grateful and honored and fun it is, well, maybe not fun on this topic, but honored to be here with both of you talking about this very important issue. I'm the executive director of the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance. It's an organization that's been in existence since 1998. It was founded by a number of key women thinkers sitting around a dining room table that were inspired and put together a conference in 1997. 1,400 people showed up, and from that came JOFA. In all the years since JOFA has come into existence, JOFA has worked to educate and advocate and build pathways forward for women in leadership roles and communal roles and expanding education. And one of the core issues for JOFA, that really the pioneers who founded JOFA and who were really pioneers in advocacy, is on Agunah prevention work. So it's an honor to carry on that legacy. It is work that that all these years later, I think we thought that we would see a better solution towards, and there's certainly steps and awareness, but our work is not yet done, and I think that's why we're all here tonight.
Yeah. So we're each going to talk a little bit about what we see and why what we are doing in this area. Everything that I've seen in the past 12 years of living in Israel has led me to an understanding that the Jewish community is facing a real crisis in its identity. We are heading towards an extremism that the results of which are first seen with women and girls, but actually affect the entire community. In terms of being an advocate against the scourge that has become Jewish divorce is actually quite personal for me. I have an aunt who was being denied a get by her husband. And while she was in America and I was in Israel, her ex-husband, her civilly divorced husband, was living in Israel. And I wound up being her stand-in in the courts. And so I literally had the experience of standing in the Beit Din and trying to get a divorce for a woman whose husband didn't bother showing up to the court system, and he didn't bother being part of the case. And even though it wasn't my divorce and it wasn't my marriage, I experienced what it was like to be a woman in a religious court with no voice. And I have to tell you that as someone who's religious and as someone who grew up in Lakewood and someone who grew up loving Judaism, it was an absolute and complete shock to be in a situation where our voices didn't matter and our needs were simply not considered. And it took me years of battling in the court, finding advocates, finding lawyers, finding rabbis, finding Knesset members, just to secure a divorce for my aunt from a man who didn't even show up. And I think that experience transformed my understanding of what it is to be a woman in Judaism, and going backwards and recognizing that when we get married, no one says to us, do you understand what you are doing right now? Do you understand that by accepting this ring, you are saying that if he walks away, or if God forbid he's in a coma, you may never, ever move forward. Women do not understand what that means. God bless my mother-in-law, but she did say to me before I got married, I should sign a prenup. And I went to my rabbi and I said, should I sign a prenup? And he goes, I'll break his knees. How utterly irresponsible of a rabbi to say that to me. But you're going to know me in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? You're going to be able to rescue me from a situation? How utterly irresponsible he was. And I actually signed a prenup a few years ago. My husband's like, something I should know? And I was like, no, but this is something that I advocate for a lot, and I never did it, and this is something I want to do. And so being in that situation, I think I might be the only one who's actually had to advocate in that direct way, especially in Israel, I think, really turned me into what I am and really made me realize that if women do not get the rights and the influence and the ability to affect policy, that it's never going to be a just Judaism. And so I will just say briefly that in Israel, you don't have a civil divorce. There's no such thing. You are either married or you are divorced religiously. And so you can be the most secular person in the world. You can not care a whit about religion, but you will always be legally tied to this person unless you have a divorce. And the people who are in charge of that divorce are only the rabbinic courts. And there's no other court. If you're Christian, you go to a Christian court. If you're Muslim, you go to Sharia court. And if you're Jewish, you go to a Jewish court. And I'll talk about, I think, solutions afterwards. But for right now, I just want to say that in Israel, this is a systemic problem. And while the prenup is used, the prenup is not yet accepted in the religious courts in Israel. So we have another layer of challenge after that.
Thanks so much, Shoshana. I also signed a postnup because I didn't know about it before I got married. So I guess I'll speak first to just the breadth and scope of the problem, just to give you some of that perspective. And then I'll just tell you about some of the most common sort of pain points that we see in the Jewish divorce process in the United States that leads to so many Agunah cases. So one of the challenges, we get an email probably every other day at ORA that says, how many Agunot are there, can you tell me? And it's a really hard question to answer because everyone defines an Agunah differently. Most people define an Agunah as someone who has a Beit Din or religious court ruling against their spouse in some topic related to the get, whether it's for not showing up or for not issuing a get. However, many people really struggle to get that ruling, which is what I'm going to talk about in a moment, which makes it really hard to define exactly how many people are dealing with this problem. And actually, the way that I got into doing this work was that I was in law school. I wanted to do a summer internship on something to do with domestic abuse. And I interviewed with an agency that said, we just got this grant to work on domestic abuse in the Orthodox community. Are you interested? And I said, sure. So what I was doing is helping represent domestic violence victims from religious communities in matrimonial and family law cases. And what I found was that the get was kind of like this boogeyman in the background that was actually determining a lot of the strategy of the divorce. That half of the meetings between the attorneys and the clients were, well, we're going to file for this because then in exchange for the get, we're going to switch it to that. Half of the strategy was really about that. So what I've really come to feel is that it almost doesn't matter how many Agunot there are and how we count them. I mean, of course it matters, but I don't think it's the most important statistic, because what I really feel is that for all Orthodox couples going through divorce, the fact that the get exists and that it can be used against you, it sort of casts a shadow over the experience, even if not a single word is said about the topic in the entire divorce process. And a lot of the work that we're doing now to educate attorneys, and our goal is to educate judges, which we're working on ways to do that, is to really explain that you don't realize it, but this entire litigation is happening in the shadow of this get. And it's almost like in the cartoons where someone has like a little storm cloud on top of them that's following them wherever they go. That's almost what's happening in these cases. And it might be invisible to everyone who just isn't clued into this issue, but that it really is something that follows couples. It impacts decision making in a really profound way. And it just inspires a tremendous amount of fear. And this goes all the way back in the process, that when in earlier years at ORA, I used to do all of the intakes, and I would just have conversation after conversation with women going through divorce. And I had more conversations than I can count with women who were still married, who were thinking about divorce, and said, well, what's the point? Because even if I leave, I'm probably not going to get my get, so I might as well stay. So you see that even before the separations happened, the impact on decision making is profound. And so that's why we really think of this as a big issue, because the fact that it's there changes the way divorce happens in the Orthodox community. And then just shifting a moment to sort of the pain points. Where do these cases get stuck? Where do they fall apart? There are a number of them. But one challenge we have is that, just as Shoshana was describing in Israel, there is no separation between church and state. In some ways, our challenge in the United States is that there is a separation between church and state. And a get is not really a legally actionable item. And there are many creative ways to use the law in order to obtain a get, but they require a lot of finesse, and it really requires expertise on both the legal issues as well as the halachic or the Jewish legal issues involved in order to really finally hone these strategies. And so the challenge that many people who call us are struggling with is that they're dealing with multiple systems. They're trying to get through a civil divorce, which is no picnic, and also get through the religious court system, which is extremely complicated and difficult to navigate in the United States. And they might have a lawyer that knows about the civil side but doesn't know anything about the get. And they might have a Tohen or a rabbinic advocate that knows all about the Beit Din world but doesn't know the first thing about court. And how do they come up with a strategy that makes sense as a whole given those two different systems? And I will say a second issue that we see quite frequently is also the get being used as a bargaining chip in divorce negotiations. These are cases where the get is not being withheld for years or for decades necessarily, but the get is either explicitly or implicitly used as leverage in the negotiations on property, custody, and other end of marriage issues. And so we are doing a tremendous amount of advocacy in the Jewish community to explain exactly why this is A, form of domestic abuse, B, just a bad way to solve problems, and C, a poor solution for everyone as a whole. Because I think what we're seeing, and then I'll pass on the floor, but that, divorce rates are rising somewhat in the Orthodox community. This is not the world of 30 years ago, 50 years ago, where people really very rarely got divorced because the stigma was so high. And I think what we're really lacking is a model for healthy divorce. And so one thing I say to people all the time, people will say, well, I have to use the get as leverage because I want to have as much access to my children as possible. And I will say, I promise you, the best way to see your children as much as possible is to get along with your ex. And that solution is going to give you the most access and the most time with your children over the future. So there really is an element of just also needing a conversation about, yes, we're getting divorced, but that doesn't mean that all bets are off and all the gloves come on and we lose our sense of ethics and menschlichkeit in the process of this divorce, that there are ways to get through this process without that happening, and communities should not foster those types of high conflict divorces that ultimately destroy everyone in the process. So that's just a little bit about what we're seeing right now, and I'll just close by saying again, to give you a sense of numbers, we work on about 75 active cases at a time from all over the world across the Jewish community. About 20% of our cases come from outside the Orthodox community, which often surprises people. And again, we typically field about 1,000 calls a year just with those introductory questions. People don't know where to start, they don't know where to go, and they don't know how to set themselves up in a strong position to be able to get their get without having to give up on things that, that matter.
So, do I need the mic? No, okay. So we did sign the prenup when we got married in 1999. It was actually pretty controversial in our circles. It was a no-brainer for my husband and I. When I was at the first JOFA conference in 1997, this was something that was talked about a lot, and I was a graduate student at Yeshiva University, and it also, came up time and again. And we signed the prenup, and there were people who were like, why? What for? Are you setting yourselves up for divorce? And we were like, no, we're setting a precedent. Like, first of all, who knows what might happen? But also, we're setting a precedent for everybody else. Let this be the norm, that everybody should sign a prenup. And then, God forbid, you find yourself in a situation and you have some legal recourse. And we can talk about the pluses and minuses about the prenup, but it's an important tool that's there. My activism, it's interesting. My activism started also from a family relationship where it was a close relative who she got married, and her husband apparently had suffered from some form of mental illness and stopped taking his medication when they got married because he was afraid that she was going to find out, and within a few months had unfortunately unraveled. And so the families decided her family decided that they should dissolve the marriage, but then it became this race against time of what happens if he has such a severe mental breakdown that he can't come back from, and then that renders her an Agunah in a different way than a man who can't or who won't give his wife a get. And so it became this kind of race and pressure and whatnot. And in hindsight, when you look at, and we'll come back to like the Talmudic tools that give you an out for marriage, that this actually would have been such an accommodation that really would have precluded her from needing a get. But fast forward a bunch of years later, I was working for the Reform movement, and another friend of mine was getting divorced. It was probably one of my first friends getting divorced, and her husband woke up one day and decided that he wasn't going to be observant anymore, and he got up and moved out. And so she went to our local rabbi and said, "Look, I really need to get my get," and he said, "What's the rush? Like, maybe you guys will work it out, maybe whatever." And she was like, "No, he moved out, he's not coming back." And he was like, "Well, what's the rush? It's not like any rabbi is going to run to remarry him." And she said, "You don't understand, he's not observant. He could decide next week that he's going to get married by a Reform rabbi." And I at the time was working for the Reform movement, and she told me the story, and I was like, this doesn't sound right. The Reform movement being, stalwart leaders in social justice and, standing up for equality for all. And so I went to work the next day and I mentioned it to my boss at the time, and we together then drafted a resolution that went before the Central Conference of American Rabbis. It was a resolution about recalcitrant husbands to make sure that that for rabbis who are performing marriages to ask the question, if it's somebody who it's not their first marriage, is your ex-spouse waiting on a get from you? And if they are, then to not perform the marriage and whatnot. So it was a different kind of tool, which is interesting because you do have non-Orthodox couples that come to you. But more recently, an interesting story happened to me. I was on my way home. I live in Maryland. I work in New York. I spend a lot of time on Amtrak. And I got on the train and kind of closed my eyes and nodded off. And all of a sudden, my phone blew up. And apparently that day, the 7th grade, the girls, I have a daughter in 7th grade, they learned about the laws of SOTA, the adulterous woman. And then that conversation morphed into a conversation about marriage and divorce, and they found out all the details about who's in charge. We didn't talk about this, but I just want to read the passages from Kedushin that talk about what marriage is, because I think it's important to cover that. So it says, Ha'isha niknet b'shlosha drachim, v'konat atzma b'shtei drachim. So a woman is acquired in 3 ways, and buys her freedom, I guess, in 2 ways. And niknet bekesef, b'shtar uvebiyah. So the marriage occurs through a financial transaction, a contract, or through sexual relations. Vekona et atzma begeit uvemitat haba'al. And she acquires her own freedom either by acquiring the get or by the death of her spouse. And so I guess that the kids had kind of delved into this, and the girls were up in arms. The Judaic classes are sex segregated, and the girls were all upset. And what do we do? And the parents called, and I had like 3 different parents call me and said, JoFeh needs to go in and set the record straight. And I said, what record should we set straight? That's what it says. That's exactly what it says. We're an Orthodox institution. That's our HaHaHa. That is what we are abiding by. And I said, the more important question is, what are they teaching the boys? Because if you start educating the boys young that this is the HaHaHa, it is true. And if you gauge the reaction, if the reaction is, oh, that doesn't seem fair, then you're hopefully on the right path. If the reaction is, oh, shelo asani isha, then maybe you have some re-educating to do. And if it's somewhere in the middle, you need to keep the conversation going. So part of the sensitizing has to do with couples who are getting married, but I think we have to start much younger. And JoFeh is getting called into schools with more frequency to come to talk about healthy education, consent, respect, safety, whatnot. And I think that when you start those conversations young, I think in many cases you can obviate the need for a get, because you just learn basic respect and how to avoid this kind of abuse.
Daphne, you mentioned the halakha, and this is my big thing, okay? What is halakha, and what is a social and cultural norm in Judaism? So it is halakha that the man needs to give his wife a get. True. It is halakha that there are ways to dissolve a marriage that are not a divorce. Okay? We will talk about those in a minute. But I want to just say what's also not halakha, because Chochmat Nashim finds that there is a big blurring of lines, and there is a lot of defensiveness when people are like, well, that's the halakha, and they don't often know what they're talking about, but they like to hide behind it. And that's a really good way of not getting anywhere. So it is not halakha to send a woman back to an abusive husband. It is not halakha to tell a woman that she should simply buy her freedom. Okay? We have many, many cases where the man doesn't want to give the get, and the woman wants the get, and she says, I want a divorce, and the court will say to the husband, well, what do you want in exchange for it? But that's not what you're supposed to be doing, right? You don't ask a man how he wants his wife to purchase her freedom. That's not halakha. And when a woman says, I'm in an abusive situation, I don't want to be in this situation, I'm looking to you, Dayanim, the arbitrators of Jewish law, to help me get out of the situation, the response isn't, well, don't ask for a divorce and he won't beat you. And you can read these piskei halakha, this piskei din, sorry, they're available for reading, and we've got a lot of them. And what I find tragic, like more tragic than anything else, and I'm sorry if there's anyone who gets upset, but the apathy and the raising of the hands and saying, en malasot, there's nothing we can do. I'm struggling to find another part of Judaism where we say, en malasot. I really can't think of it. I'm happy for answers if people want to give me one, but I find that this is the place where people are happy to say, there's nothing that we can do, kacha, that's the way it is. Or if I hear another rabbi or dayan say to me, you don't know the sleepless nights I have trying to help Agunot. Oh, I don't know the sleepless nights you have. Oh, really? I think I do. I'm actually pretty sure I do. And while I respect, and there are many, many wonderful rabbis and dayanim who are absolutely what Rav Avadia Yosef was, an absolute tzaddik and a gadol in this area, there are far too many who think they can't do anything. And those who do, those who go out on a limb, those who make these cases that are unbelievable. There's a case in Tzfat. there was a case a few years ago of a woman whose husband was injured in a motorcycle accident, and he's in a coma. He's only alive by a plug. If you unplug him, he is no longer viable, okay? And so she's actually halachic Agunah, dafka. And so the Dayanim said, it was actually one Dayan who said, this is something that we can solve with this tool called get zikui. Okay, there's a halachic concept of zikui, which means that I'm doing something in your benefit. So for example, let's say a man isn't religious and he's not interested in selling his chametz, okay? I can sell his chametz for him because it's to his benefit. And yet we would know if he knew and he understood the implications, that he would really want to do it. So he took this halachic concept of a zikui, of doing something in someone's zchut, and he said if this man was conscious, he would want to free his wife because he can't be a husband to her right now. And he went out on this creative halachic, it was like 72 page decision. He also used 2 other halachic mechanisms. It wasn't on a whim. The woman was 27 years old when her husband went into a coma. She was 34, 7 years she waited. And he said if this man was conscious, he would want to do it. And he wrote her a get in the man's honor and freed this woman to have children. She was 34 years old. She went and got married. And then Rav Avadia's son, who was the current Sephardic chief rabbi, Rav Yitzchak Yosef, went and tried to undo the get. Undo a get. Do you understand what happens when you undo a get? You understand what happens. Do you understand what happens when you undo a get? The potential for undoing a get and what that means for the woman's next husband and children? Creating mamzerim, the thing that they say that they want to avoid by making marriage so strong. You don't make strong marriages when you make divorce impossible. That's not what you're doing. You're not making strong marriages. A strong marriage happens way before there's even a divorce on the in consideration. And so actually the women, Mevoei Satum took, it's an organization in Israel that represents Agunot and goes and takes case law, and they took the Rabbanut to court in the Supreme Court, and they said you cannot reopen a divorce case. And it really went very far to the point where the Supreme Court looked at the Rabbanut, and they don't like to get involved. They really don't like to mix the two. As much as it's mixed, they don't like to do it, like to force someone else to do it. And they said, I suggest you go back and figure out another way to do this. Because if they had to go and force the Rabbanut to do it, it would have been a whole other can of worms. And so they backed down off their tree. But he was about to convene 31 rabbis and try to reopen this case because it was terrifying to them. The idea of being creative in divorce and freeing women was terrifying to them. And I have to say, what else is there? What has to be on the line for you to be creative, to use the beauty of HaHaHa? HaHaHa is a beautiful, amazing set of rules that gives us the derech, the way to chai behem, to live with them, not be tortured by them. And for me, the most absolutely disappointing and frustrating aspect of this is that we don't have creative and strong, brave, loving leadership that is willing to take this on. And all I do with my microphone is call on leadership and say, Ayecha, where are you? Come and help us and do something about this horrible, horrible thing. And I just can't. I just get so upset every time I talk about it. Sorry.
Can I just interject on that? I don't need to. The one exception that I found to that in terms of like being creative and finding solutions was after 9/11, there were a number of Agunot who became Agunot after the towers fell, and their husbands were gone, and they created new precedents through the use of DNA and witnesses that were not normally be witnesses. They managed to free every single Agunah. So it's not like they can't, they won't, except for in this case that it was like such a clear-cut tragic, though in your case it was also clear-cut tragic.
There's a difference between an Agunah, a classic Agunah, which is someone whose husband cannot be found, and a Misurevet get, which we didn't even define. But a Misurevet get is literally someone who's being denied a divorce, and it's different from a classic Agunah. At this day and age, we've kind of just lumped them all together, but there's a big difference between not finding the husband and having a live husband there saying, I will not free her. And so I should have clarified that there are also ways to deal with that. And the one thing I will say is that I don't understand why our B'tei Din don't say, get extortions off the table. It's like clear to me. It's like, why wouldn't the Israeli B'tei Din and the Beit Din of America, which you can probably talk to much better than I can, but why don't they say, you can't walk in here and extort for your get? You're here to work this out, to make the get happen, but no one can, not the man and not the woman, cannot put a price on freedom. Well, that is not violating Jewish law. Why can't they do that?
So all really, really powerful points. And I'll say in terms of our work at ORA, what we really want to do is really create a culture change around this issue. And the reason that I think we have been able to see a lot of movement is the problem solved? No, obviously we're all not sitting up here if that were the case, but I really feel like I can say that it is different than it was 5 years ago. And we've moved forward. Do we need more movement? 100%. But I think that we are seeing that change. And part of that is that, you know, we work with rabbis and with Batei Din all day, and there are exceptional rabbis that are really willing to put themselves out there for this issue, and there are other rabbis that make me sort of cry on the highway on my way home because I'm so sad sometimes to see what's being done in the name of Torah, but they are both there. And a big part of what we're trying to do at ORA is really create as much support as we possibly can for all the rabbis out there who are doing good and who want to do more good. And so we have this helpline, and we get calls from congregational rabbis all the time saying, I have this case that's brewing in my community. Am I supposed to do something? Is it better if I don't get involved? Like, what do I do? And we are so glad people ask that question, because it is hard sometimes to know when is the best time to intervene and what's the best way to intervene. And there are a lot of people who want to do the right thing and need maybe a little bit of encouragement, a little bit of guidance on what that is and how to do that. And there are people out there already doing the right thing. It's all out there. And one thing that I've really learned in working on this issue is that it's sort of the and instead of the but, that our community can do some terrible things and it can do some extraordinary things, and they're both there. And I'll just share sort of one story that encapsulates that for me just before I move to the solutions piece, but is that I was working on a terrible case in a particular Hasidic community. And I remember driving home thinking, like, you know, I really work so hard to respect every community that I'm working in, because I feel like you can't make positive change in a community if you don't have that respect. But I remember driving home thinking, what am I doing? Obviously, this is just like a bad community. Like I'm talking to person after person and having these issues. And then as I'm driving home, I drove over a nail and I got a flat tire. And sort of fun fact, AAA will tow you if you don't have a spare tire. But Chaverim, which is like the Orthodox AAA in New York, will actually come and bring you an extra tire. So I call Chaverim as I'm sort of on the side of the road, 15 minutes until daycare is closing. I have like a million car seats in the back seat. And this van pulls up from Chaverim, and a group of men from this same Hasidic group that I was working on this case get out of the van and change my tire for me and don't charge me anything and send me on my way and make sure I have everything I need. And it really was that reminder for me that there's both. There is good and there is bad, and really trying to hold both at the same time I think is so important. And in terms of, I guess, just orientation to this issue and solutions, and I wrote an article a few years ago that sort of outlined this in more detail, but one thing that I really, really believe is that get refusal is not only a form of domestic abuse, but it's actually a form of spiritual abuse, which is basically a subset of domestic abuse where you take religion and religion becomes part of the abuse. And what I have seen is that in any community of any religion, by the way, in any community where religion is a big part of the communal structure, religion is going to be part of the abuse. It's very hard to separate them. And I think the reason that definition is so important is that because this is a spiritual problem, it requires a spiritual solution. Even if all the attorneys in the world could solve this, right? It's not enough for the attorneys in the world to solve this, because this is a problem where Judaism is basically being co-opted and sort of given a sword and weaponized in the name of abuse. The Jewish community needs to be on the front lines of really healing that and changing that. And so I think it's absolutely critical that there's a spiritual response to this spiritual problem. Determining which of those solutions is the right one is really difficult work. one thing that I think is unique about just the way we do things at ORA is that we're doing very broad strokes advocacy and awareness, and we're also working on real cases every day. And we work in a big open office, so we hear each other and pretty much know what's going on in all the different segments of the organization. And I think the challenge and the value of that has been that the theory can never get too far from the reality. That we want, when we're advocating for solutions, that those solutions are also responsive to the needs and the interests of the people that are calling us and asking for our support. And I would say that overall, our theory of change, or our model of really changing the culture on this, is really from within. That we feel that if this change is going to be deep and lasting, it has to be organic, it has to be from within. And just to kind of end on a more hopeful note, I mean, I know we're not ending necessarily quite yet, but I really think that culture change is slow and it's hard and it's long, but it really can happen. And one sort of short story is that we have a lot of couples come into the ORA office to sign prenups. And a few years ago, I mean, I always ask people, like, what made you sign a prenup? I'm curious. And a few years ago, they were all activists. They would say, well, I care about the Agunah issue and I'm here to make a difference. And a few months ago, we had a couple come in to sign a prenup, and the bride-to-be was sort of like on her phone looking at something. So I said, oh, what made you decide to sign a prenup? And she just kind of looked up and said, well, like, doesn't everyone? And went back to her phone. And I was really excited because I was like, yes, right, exactly. Everyone does. We're getting somewhere. So I think that the change is slow, but it's really a question of rewiring the culture, because ultimately, again, get refusal is a form of domestic abuse. People don't commit domestic abuse by themselves, so that gets kind of tiring. They really need communal support and communal energy to engage in that abuse and continue that abuse, and by the community changing its basic understanding of the issue, it really changes the way individual get refusers behave, and it can really stop it in its tracks, and we've seen that be effective over the long game.
Yes. And I hope to see a larger proliferation of the prenup being signed in communities across the board, but we're not there yet, and it doesn't always work, right? There's still people who still hold out, who it doesn't matter that they signed it, and that much worse for people who haven't yet signed it. The hope and the goal, I think, is to really find and implement systemic change, so that it's not, did you sign the prenup, did you not? There needs to be, it needs, like you talk about what is HaHaHa, what is not HaHaHa. It needs to be institutionalized, that there has to be systemic change so that no woman is stuck being an Agunah or a mesurevet get, either way, for a second longer than, and it should be 100% solutions. Like we just need to get there. And there have been attempts over the years. In the 90s, Rabbi Rachman created a Beit Din, which was discredited. And in 2006, there was supposed to be some big gathering in Jerusalem with rabbis from across the board. And that was canceled last minute because of external pressure. And in Britain, there were creative halachic solutions that were suggested and also discredited. And then in 2014, the International Beit Din came along, founded by Rabbi Simcha Kraus. And they have had some success and still a lot of resistance and pushback on the other side. And one of the things that they say is that they will not deal with any extortion. Like that is like they are transparent in their halachic solutions, much to the chagrin of many rabbis, because many rabbis are like, if I tell people the secret loophole that I found, then maybe they'll try and take back the get, in exactly the case scenario that you described. And so they are transparent. They leave no stone unturned. There's never this moment of, Chaval, I wish I could do something for you. Sometimes it takes them longer to get there. And sometimes just the fact that the women come to the International Beit Din to explore that as a solution, that sometimes their recalcitrant husbands then realize that she now has leverage. And so then he will give her the get. Many of the women have been freed by the International Beit Din either by get or by ptor. And They don't take gittin or cases from other batei din. They're, again, 100% transparent. And still, there is a lot of resistance. And I'm confounded why. It's disturbing. People should be hopeful and optimistic that there are solutions, and they should be systematized across the board. It is befuddling to me, that, as I said before, that we're in 2019 and we're still struggling with how do we find solutions, systemic solutions to the plight of the Agunah.
So I think I'd like to talk a little bit about what we see in Israel in terms of things that have worked. Sometimes, in advocacy, when you run up against a brick wall, you have to bypass. I'm a big believer in the idea of bypassing. You just go around it. If someone's standing in your way, just be like, "Excuse me," and just walk around. And what I've found is that being creative, if beyond the pre and post nup when it doesn't work, beyond going to a bit din that perhaps could free you, because in Israel we do not have that yet. What we have found are ways to influence the system, ways to bring change to the system where you probably cannot do it here yet. And yet there was in the London Beit Din also an example, and I'll say what I'm saying. So basically, we found that when women are part of the process, things start to change. Toanot Rabbanut are a wonderful advent. They are women who are trained in Jewish law, in HaHaHa, of divorce, marriage and divorce, and they go into the courts and they represent women in the Beit Din. Now, before there existed women Toanot, there was the woman seeking the divorce, her male representative, the husband she's seeking to be divorced from, his male representative, 3 male dayanim, and the male secretary who was taking down the notes. So the only woman in the courtroom was the one going through a monumental life change, something that was absolutely life-altering. In the best case scenario, a divorce is difficult, okay? Every divorce is difficult to whatever extent you're having. But when there's an abusive situation, when there's a situation where she has to advocate, fight for her rights, and she's the only woman there, and she has to tell a man all the intimate details of what she's gone through, all the difficulty that she's gone through, what she needs for herself and for children, you're talking about a situation where a woman is at an incredible disadvantage, before you even get to the get, okay? So Rabbi Riskin, God bless him, recognized this concern, and he created a program where women would come in and represent women, so that she has a female advocate, so that she has someone she could speak to, that she has someone who had compassion and understanding for her position, which, as wonderful as men are, they will simply never, ever, ever be an Agunah. They will never be in a situation where their children could be mamzerim, ever. It doesn't matter how wonderful of a man you are, you will never understand what that feels like, ever. So number one, having a woman in the courtroom was a massive difference for women, for the compassion, for the understanding, for the being seen as a human being. And I know, because I've interviewed Toanot before, those who started in the first class 25 years ago, when they weren't even allowed in the Beit Din, they weren't even allowed their certificates. The Rabbanut didn't give them their certificates. They took the test and they walked out the door. They wouldn't give it to them. And they had to go back to the Supreme Court. And then they were finally allowed into the courtroom, and then the Dayanim didn't talk to them. They didn't talk to them. They didn't recognize them. How is this a court of justice? So finally the women, 20 years later, she will tell me the difference from when she started and they wouldn't speak to her till now, where they hand cases to the Toanot. They say, I think this is a case you guys would be fantastic with. The change in the attitude and the approach towards women in the Beit Din is a monumental change to seeing women and their needs as vital, important, and almost as important as the men. And I'm sorry to be sarcastic, and it just blows my mind, Daphne. I really feel what you're feeling right now. So the Toanot made a massive difference for women, the representation, and letting Dayanim understand that they're talking about human beings and people with needs that maybe I didn't understand. It's okay to say that. It's okay to say, I didn't understand that before. I've learned Gemara my whole life, and I could tell you ins and outs, but human beings, I never had a lot of conversations with women who are victims of abuse. I never understood the psychology of why would a woman stay for 10 years. You're looking at a woman in a courtroom and saying, but if it was so bad, why did you stay? Who can say that nowadays? You don't say these things to a victim of abuse. You know that that's not how it works. But they didn't understand that was how it worked because they didn't have psychology courses. They didn't have social work courses. Bringing women in changed the system. And in London, in the Beit Din, they brought in a woman who was just an administrator. I don't mean to say just an administrator, but she didn't have power other than administration. But you know what she had? Access and compassion. And she would take out the cases that weren't looked at for 15 years. And she'd open it up and she'd say, isn't that the guy that just opened that massive store down the street? Isn't that the guy who's holding a gala tonight? Do you think if we said to him, hey, you wouldn't want a demonstration on the night you opened your big gala, would you? That wouldn't be great. Wouldn't you rather come and sign the divorce? Creative solutions to things that people aren't worried about anymore because en ma lasot, there's nothing to do. But there is something to do. There are creative ways to look at things. There are aspects to take. There are things to think of. One more example of an incredibly creative solution that actually was a little bit hard for me to make a decision on as an activist in Israel, but Rabbi Pinchas Goldschmidt is the head of he's the chief rabbi of Moscow, and he's the head of the Council of Conference of European Rabbis, exactly, thank you. And he actually came to Elisa Levi, she was a Knesset member, and he said, I have a lot of women who are waiting for their divorces in Russia, and their wives have remarried. I'm sorry, their husbands have remarried. And they're already living with new women, and they don't really care about HaHaHa, they're not religious, but these women are stuck. And he said, and I know that specifically for my Russian congregants, constituents, they want to have access to Israel. And the moment you close off Israel to them, they have something to lose. Meaning, he said, every Russian Jew has an escape plan. That's what he was saying. Very different than Americans. We don't, maybe in a few years we'll feel that way, but right now we don't feel that way. They all want to be able to go somewhere. And so the minute, he said, if you were to extend the purview of the Rabbanut onto Russia, onto Europe, outside of Israel, then I could tell them that the Rabbanut could put them in jail. Now, for women activists in Israel, the last thing you want to do is give the Rabbanut more power. Okay, it just doesn't work. And it became a real struggle between wanting to help these women who he felt would actually be helped and not wanting to expand the power of a body that doesn't really do good right now. And so they worked on it, compromised, and they fought about it, but I want to tell you the result. All it took for him was to say to these men, 12 in the first week, to say, I'm just letting you know that your case is now with the Rabbanut of Israel, and you, the minute you step into Israel, will be arrested and brought into jail. They signed it right away. They just signed it right away, because the moment their freedom was at risk, well, that wasn't going to happen, so they signed it right away. And so you have creative solutions to problems that don't touch halakha, even though I agree with you, there has to be a halachic systemic solution. But if for those people who argue with us and say, we can't do anything about halakha, yeah, okay, so then find a bypass. That's what I'm saying.
And just to echo that, a lot of what we do is really help find those creative options. So whether it's legal tools, just a mini example, we had a case where the husband applied in California for a bifurcation, which is basically where you get a civil divorce, even though you're still negotiating the details of the divorce itself. And we talked with the Agunah about fighting it, which is rare not to get in California, but we worked with her attorney and with the local Beit Din to fight it. The court ended up denying this bifurcation because we basically made the case. He's asking to have this judgment so that he can move on with his life while he's simultaneously preventing her from moving on with her life. And the court denied it, and within 2 months the get was given. So we really see it, and a lot of what we do demonstrations, we do social media campaigns. We want to make it so that you can't live your life as if you're not doing this terrible thing and just sort of carry on as usual. And then one sort of plug I'll put out there, just especially for people who are local, if you're interested in a volunteering opportunity, we do sometimes have volunteers go with women to Beit Din, not to represent, so you don't have to worry in terms of that skill set, but just to have that support that you're not there by yourself, and then you're less likely to be sort of encouraged into signing something that you probably shouldn't be signing when you have someone there with you. So it's just an opportunity that I think is really meaningful for volunteers and also really impactful for for a woman at any point in the divorce process, again, regardless of what the label is, that support, that I think women supporting each other is so, so critical. And we have a lot of really opportunities to do that for people who are interested in that.
All right, the mic. I want to tell another story. I'm also an adjunct professor at a law school, and I have asked the students, and I always have at least a student who writes on marriage divorce issues. And so I asked the students, I'm like, okay, you're looking at the law, and most of them are not observant, I should say. Why don't you see what interesting solutions you can come up with? And they come up with mekach ta'ud, and they come up with get zikui, and they come up with all of the loopholes. And inevitably, there is always an Orthodox man in the class who chimes in and says, but he's already taken ownership of her through sex. And so how do you undo all of that? And so, let me just add in other loopholes that they find, not just from the Talmud. They look at, the questions that, well, I guess related to the Talmud also. If the witnesses are two close relatives, if that's a loophole. Rav Moshe, who was the preeminent American scholar, rabbinic scholar, until he passed away in the 80s, talks about how, which did not do wonders for pluralism, but he talks about if you had a reform or conservative witness or whatnot, or if it was performed by a conservative or a reform rabbi, then you would not need a get. And so, which again did not do wonders for pluralism, but did a lot to help Agunot, but except for when the rabbis were like, no, you still need a get. But inevitably, all of those conversations came down to, but he's already taken ownership of her. And I think that this is like some myth that needs to be broken in the yeshiva systems also, about how we talk about marriage and how women are considered in the transaction. I don't know if we're taking questions, but the other thing that I hear all the time, or too frequently, I should say, is that the Agunot are like the Kiddush Hashem of our halachic system. They're the Akedah, and I just want to say every time I hear that, it is the Chil Hashem of our system, both within the Jewish community and when non-Jews hear about the systemic abuse that happens in the name of halacha. And it is disheartening, and I still, again, I support the prenup, but I still think that there is a ways to go in just finding and implementing and instituting systemic solutions to address the plight of the Agunah.
Just to add one last thing, I also feel like we need to correct this impression a lot also. It's not a Chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name, to talk about this issue, but if we are going to be sort of a light unto the nations, I think the way we do that is by being brave enough to confront the problems that are happening in our own backyard and really establishing a blueprint of being able to talk about what's happening and to make a difference and to look out for the people on the margins, because everything in the Torah comes back to who's on the margins and are they being supported and respected and taken care of.
I always like to end whenever I'm talking about what the community can do. I want to leave you guys with something positive and not just, oh my God, this is awful. I would definitely say sign a prenup, sign a postnup, do it. It's got to become, first of all, it raises the issue. It raises awareness. It talks about it. And even if we know it's not a perfect solution, it is oftentimes a solution, because most people are not horrible people, and most people want to do the right thing. And when we talk about these things and we make it more of the, like the ketubah was something that was instituted. We have to institute the prenup. And I agree, we have to keep pressure on your rabbis, keep pressure on your community leaders. Talk about the issue all the time. Talk to your kids. Make sure that your sons are understanding that abuse is terrible. Make sure your daughters are strong daughters and insist on marrying awesome men. And I would just say, learn about the issue and don't let people tell you that it's all about halacha and that nobody really knows the answer and there's nothing that can be done. Argue that. That's not accurate. That's not true. And I personally think that Jewish marriage is certainly something that we should be fighting for. Right? This is a beautiful thing. We want Jewish marriages to work, and we want Jewish divorce not to be a horrible thing. I thank you very much for sitting here with me. I really get so much chizuk from you guys. It's amazing. And we're happy to take any questions, I believe, if anyone has any questions.
I think the question is what's being done about the prenup in day schools and how early and how widespread. So it's a really good question. We go into any high school that will let us in, which is generally all the modern Orthodox schools, and we're starting to get into some more yeshivish schools. We generally go in senior year, but we also really try to educate teachers, because if the teachers really have that as the norm, that helps them to sort of bring it up earlier, encourage even to talk about it at younger ages. In terms of bringing the prenup to other communities, the question is really having a document that's also a good cultural fit for whichever community that you're in. So documents probably are going to need to be adjusted or rebranded in order to make sense in the communities that we want to move them into. So that's sort of the next frontier, and that's something we really want to happen, and something that I think is in progress. And we are just seeing more conversation about it in more right-wing communities.
I would just say that Chochmat Nashim is starting, God willing, soon. We'll have a curriculum that deals with a lot of these issues. It's not going to be in 7th grade necessarily, because I think that might be a little bit too young. But it will be a curriculum for high school and gap year students, where all of these issues will be discussed in depth, but also in breadth. Like what exactly connects these things, and what could you possibly do in the community, and how do we look at this, and how do we solve this as a society? Is that's what really we're all about, is like, how does the Jewish community take responsibility for the issues that we're facing? I don't think all of the answers, or even most of the answers, are coming top down. I think a lot of us really understand that we have to be responsible for what's happening here. We're all the Jewish community, and so we are looking for sponsors to do this curriculum, but we have a lot of it laid out already. So I am happy to hear. Yes. The question is, why can't we just say get refusal is a crime and put him in jail? So this starts back to what Keshet said in the beginning, which is that how do you count an Agunah? How do you say that there is get refusal? I can tell you that my aunt, who I said was waiting for, I think, a total of 14 years for her get, was never considered an Agunah. You understand? She waited 14 years, but she was never considered Agunah because the Beit Din never issued the chiyuv. So she's waiting. She can't get remarried. He's refusing the get. But according to the Beit Din, she's not considered an Agunah because they never said she was. They never gave the chiyuv. The chiyuv is the decision that says he must give her the get. Okay? And so there are thousands of women who are not considered Agunot and who don't have their get. So the question you're asking is a wonderful question, but the question starts before then. Why are women having to wait for 3 men to decide they deserve a get before they're even considered an Agunah? That's what happens. They have to be, you want a divorce? What are the reasons you want a divorce? We have to decide if you deserve a divorce. That's what happens in this situations. Yeah.
So, no, not at all. But just to add to that, so the Israeli government can put people in jail. The risk, I've seen people sit in jail for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, in some cases without giving a get. And part of the reason, I think, is that it is very critical strategically to intervene early in these cases. People get stuck in their positions. They're harder to move 5 years in than they were 6 months in. And so part of the messaging we're trying to put out there is that it's really important to deal with the get as early as you can, because the longer you wait, the more people get stuck. And the more people get stuck, the more they do ridiculous things like sit in prison for years, as opposed to just doing something that will cost them $0 and, take at the most an hour of their time. So there's also, I think, a timing piece and a strategy that's important here.
There's also fewer than 10 men in jail right now for get refusals in Israel.
So the question is sort of in situations where there is someone, say, living with family, how do we make the community aware of the situation, and also just some of the challenges of dealing with the rabbinic system and, all of what can communities do to make a difference? I think, first of all, I think it's really critical just to have a baseline policy that when a marriage is over, you give a get, and there don't have to be 2 sides to every story. And I think that what often happens is that get refusers are really successful at making things super, super complicated, that you feel like you need a PhD and like 20 free hours to just like catch up before you can have an opinion. And that's really not true. It's as simple as, is the marriage over? okay, there should be a get. So I think simplifying is actually really helpful in communities getting involved. And it's more important because at the end of the day, I'm never going to know what happened in someone else's marriage, and I don't really need to. And I think that's the key point. It's not that complicated. A lot of what we're trying to do is simplify. And again, social dynamics. Human beings are social people. We want to have support and encouragement and Shabbos invitations and all those things. And when those areas get challenged, it really changes behavior. I think the key is just to do it early and to have that sense of consistency, that it's not, well, I know he's refusing a get, but I feel like it's so complicated. Who am I, just a random person, to make a statement? So I'm just going to carry on as if that isn't happening. We're very incremental in what we do. The first thing we do on a case is educate ourselves. The second thing we do on a case is try to build rapport with the other side in whatever way we can, really approach them in a non-threatening way. And every single step that we do, we warn them, we give them an opportunity. This is going to come out in the newspaper. It doesn't have to. There's going to be a rally. There doesn't need to be one. We really do it incrementally. We give them a lot of opportunities to change their minds, to do the right thing. And we really just do it consistently and incrementally, and we do that very deliberately, because if you just, sometimes people in their eagerness will do like 45 things at once, and then you've played all of your cards and you have nothing left, and now the person is more entrenched. So you want to be careful not to do that. And sometimes what we do is speak to psychologists to say, this person has a diagnosis. How can we understand this diagnosis better so we can have more tools in how we're engaging with this person? So we really try to do everything possible to not only do things that make us feel good, but also that are going to be effective. That if we make a big splash and there's no get, we haven't succeeded.
Very quickly, there was a woman being denied a get in the city of Efrat, and the entire community came together and said, not in my community. And they put up bumper stickers, signs across the lawn. They went all out, and within 3 weeks, she had a get. And the court had already issued a chiyuv. He didn't care about anything. He wasn't interested, didn't care about going to jail. The entire community came together and said, lo kan, this is not going to happen here. And they absolutely went all out, and she got her get. So I totally respect what Keshet is saying and the work that she's done. And also sometimes if the community decides they're going to do it together and they don't move, it could also get done. The question is, how can we raise boys not to do this stuff, and how does masculinity intersect with what we're talking about? I have a friend who has 4 boys, and God willing, we're going to podcast about this actually with her experiences. And she said raising boys to respect women and to understand the importance of not just respect, like respect is such a loose word. Like, what does that really mean? Like, it doesn't mean opening the door. I'm fine with opening the door, by the way. I'm not crazy about that. But like, what does it really, really mean to see women as people? And what does it really mean to understand their rights and their needs? It's an excellent question that I don't yet have specific answers to, and I'm going to pass this on to you. But as a mom of 3 boys, I think modeling, my husband modeling, the way that he speaks to me, interacts with me, respects what I'm saying, my needs, and modeling is vital. And being a strong woman is vital. You don't have to do that, but the person that you're with can do that. And I think that there are definitely letting men understand what you go through and what you're feeling. I think a lot of times we forget that they need to understand it. They won't know. I talk about this all the time. I say men experience life differently than women do. Men experience Judaism differently than women do. And so when we say to them, this is what happens to me. This is how I feel when I'm left out. This is how I feel when I'm erased. This is how I feel when I'm not heard. And letting them hear that. My kids at this point could rattle off the problems they could rattle them off. Not because I talk about it ad nauseum, but because I talk about it when it's relevant, because I give them that perspective, because I educate and encourage them without ramming it down their throats. You don't want to do that either, because then you kind of like shift. You make a guy feel that everything he does is wrong and being a masculine is threatening, then he's going to turn away. I don't believe in that. I don't believe in turning people into enemies or guilting them into feeling bad about themselves. I think there's an important balance, and I'm going to stop talking and give you guys my microphone, but like I could talk about this all day long.
I would say also it's a really powerful question. I think part of it also is I never like language that's like, oh, like men can never do X or men can't Y. I don't think that's true. I think there's just this element of also we don't see the world as everyone's, about to be a get refuser, so we better catch them with the prenup before they start. I think it's that question of having, again, the idea of respect, the idea of like communication in terms of explaining experiences, as you mentioned, and and of just having a culture, again, where to the extent we want to think about like masculinity, and we have this conversation. When I started at ORA, I was a case advocate, and I would spend all day on the phone with get refusers and almost trying to make an argument to them that being like a real man is doing the right thing even when it's really hard, is letting go even if you really don't want to. That this feeling of redefining, I guess, what masculinity looks like and defining it as sort of respect, and also that men are important peers for each other, and that when just culturally the way men talk about women, it really, I think, leads into what happens in specific relationships later on. But male friendships are very important, especially when men are going through divorce, and having really helpful messages from those friends. Because then the last thing I'll say, I've been talking a lot, but one thing I really believe is that get refusal destroys the get refuser's life as well. It's not a success for anyone. And so having messages from people that help you think forward instead of getting stuck in what happened or what you're angry about is so critical. And I think that's true for everyone, but especially just having men surrounded with other men who are giving them messages of like, let's move forward and let's think about how you can rebuild your life, and this isn't the right thing to do, is really impactful.
Yeah, I think, starting, again, I'm a proponent of starting young. I think it was Rivka Press-Schwartz who wrote about this recently, that, when you talk to teenage kids, and especially in unorthodox day schools where, when you're trying to teach about healthy relationships and consent and whatnot, you run into this, like, how do I balance HaHaHa with all of that? And one of the things that she talks about is, when you talk about relationships, you talk about HaHaHa and safety and respect. Just because you fall down on one doesn't mean that you should fall down on all three. And so really to just keep pushing the importance of safety and respect as equal to HaHaHa. And I think that chips away at this like toxic masculinity. I think that when you name words like rape culture in our pop culture, that all of a sudden you're like, oh, that actually is a thing, and it is a terrible thing that we are all exposed to and that we expose our children to. And I like to think that I have two girls, 12 and 15. My 12-year-old doesn't know that there are boys in her class yet, but the 15-year-old does. And I like to think that these boys are a little bit aware. Actually, Shoshana spoke to them last week, and I think that you came away. Yeah, they're very aware. They're aware.
It was absolutely incredible to see. I want to say something to your question. Jewish masculinity is dafka not taking the advantage that halacha, that Jewish law gives to men, and using it as a cudgel. I think Jewish masculinity is knowing that that is not something that you're supposed to do. And the whole idea of hu yimshol bach, which is he will dominate you, was a curse for women and not something that should happen. And I really, really think that Jewish men at this point need to use their masculinity to assist the women in their lives, about the Jewish women, and to say, this is my problem to solve. This is my space, and I want to help. I think that is the new definition, the correct definition of Jewish masculinity, and I really appreciate you asking the question. I really, really do. Okay? Is it possible for a woman to prove that she deserves a divorce? So in the Gemara, in the Talmud, it talks about specific reasons that a woman would be deserving of a divorce, and it varies from impotence to him being a tanner and having a foul smell. Okay, some of these things are very specific, and a Beit Din that knows what it's doing would be able to then use these as categories as opposed to specific circumstances and to expand them. And so the answer to your question is yes, in theory. Yes, in theory, there are things that a woman can do to prove that she deserves a divorce. It is not easy to do in Israel. But it is getting better as Dayanim recognize women, that the fact that she stayed with someone abusive doesn't mean that she liked the abuse or that she tolerated it well. It could be many, many circumstances. And so it's getting better. There's a lot of halacha involved that I don't want to really get into so much, but the answer, at least in Israel, is that it's possible, not easy. I don't know how it is here.
Yeah. I'll speak to the community piece more. What we've seen is that an overall shift in our cases, that as the prenup has become more the norm in the modern Orthodox community and become more of the fabric, that it's awkward to withhold a get. There are more social costs. We're just getting more and more cases from more right-wing communities. So I think at this moment we're seeing it more, but I also think that there's sort of a rise in divorce. There's more conversations about how we divorce, and that we're seeing those conversations start to happen in more right-wing communities. It's obviously a different cultural atmosphere, but I will say that I have found it really interesting and surprising working, especially in Hasidic communities, that a lot of my own expectations for how things work and how you're allowed to talk to people have actually been challenged. That I think the dynamics are more complex, and the way that power works is more complex than we see, and I've often found myself a little bit surprised in different situations. Perfect. Oh, and I guess I'll just add, in terms of why people withhold a get, we typically see, in order to get things, custody, finances, etc., sometimes they still want to stay together. Sometimes they're just really mad and want to torture the other person. But what it really comes down to is power and control, which is what all abuse comes down to. It's, I'm the one that's going to decide how this ends and when this ends.
Yeah, I don't.
Sorry. Let's do it one more time.
On the last question, again, it's about power and control, and I think that every woman, when she goes into the Beis Din on the day that she's supposed to get her get, still holds her breath because she knows that the last minute that he may change his mind, as amicable as their separation may be. But then multiply that gajillion times when it's an acrimonious divorce and you jump through all the hoops of fire, even if there's not extortion, even if you dissolve all of the assets and figure out the custody. But there's still that fear that at the last minute either he could say, or the Beit Din could say, go home and figure it out. And so, these are burdens that women have to carry as they go through this process.
Thank you very, very much for coming.
Everybody for being here. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.